We now continue our discussion of the historic tornado outbreak of May 31st, 1985, with three meteorologists who tracked the storms that day. The original hosts of Weather World, Paul Knight and Fred Gadomski, and Dr. Greg Forbes, who was on the Penn State faculty at that time and later became the severe weather expert at the Weather Channel. Welcome back, gentlemen. Greg, why don't you, we finished part one of this talking a little bit about the weather that day. Could you continue that discussion? What did the weather map look like? What were the ingredients coming into play?
Well, it was a cold front that was coming from the Great Lakes states, the Midwest area. So in eastern Ohio and western Pennsylvania, the temperatures in the afternoon got up to around 80 or even the low 80s, and it was very moist. Dew point for the dew point fans was about 70 degrees. Central Pennsylvania was much different. It was more like a warm front, and so it began like in the 60s, and with a little bit of afternoon heating then snuck in. I think it got to around 70. So it was more questionable whether storms could get going in central Pennsylvania. And nothing really got going in the United States until about 5 o'clock. There had been some storms fired about 3 o'clock, tornadoes up in Canada. But then as the late afternoon and evening progressed, an upper air disturbance came out blasting out of Minnesota and Wisconsin all the way then into Ohio and Pennsylvania, added that cold air aloft, and the storms just exploded and turned deadly.
Fred, could you take us through the preparations for the show that day? I mean, as Paul had alluded to previously, and Greg just there, things didn't pop until late. So there must have been some anticipation of whether anything was going to happen at all.
That's how I remember it. Once again, we pointed out in the last segment that several days before, it was clear that there was going to be the pattern that would produce severe weather of some kind in the northeastern part of the United States. But as the show was getting prepared on that Friday, because of the timing that Greg was just alluding to, and because of our show with the first tornado at 5, we're already trying to drive across campus to our location where the studio is. So I remember the preparation as relatively straightforward on any kind of thunderstormy, potential severe weather day. I think Paul might have been doing the short-term weather that day. That's how I remember it. Is that true, Paul?
Yeah, Fred, I had the nod on the short-term forecast. And while I did mention, I seem to recall that we were in a tornado watch and storms were beginning to develop. I personally had no idea the magnitude of the severity of the storms that were just starting to erupt.
Now, one thing I do remember is after the show, I was doing the extended forecast, so I had it easy. I was looking into next week, there was no problem. But one of the things, I did come back to the weather station after the show, and Greg Forbes was in the radar room with like about 100 people, and it's a very small room, and he was, twirling the knobs on the radar like a virtuoso as the stuff started to break off to our west and north.
And you're twirling the knobs, Greg, and it's my understanding you were so concerned about what you were seeing on radar with that supercell moving through central Pennsylvania that you called the National Weather Service in Pittsburgh?
Yeah, I did. As we began to see that storm that went through the Moshannon and the Sproul State Park area, Parker Dam area, I knew that our radar could get a better look at that storm than they could out of Pittsburgh. And so I called Pittsburgh. We had this monstrous hook. It was a textbook picture. And inside that hook, there was this little ball that we now call a debris ball from tornado tossing up, as we now know, branches and things out of trees. So I knew there was a potentially deadly tornado going through there. So I called them to make sure that they could know that there was a real bad tornado in progress in all likelihood.
And so, Fred, you're back in the Weather Center after the show. How long until the enormity of the magnitude of this event became apparent?
It wasn't too long when that radar that was on our roof, there were multiple tornado signatures happening one after another, and it became relatively clear that this was something that would be remembered for some time to come. And of course, that Black Moshannon situation was, I think, kind of unprecedented.
Yeah, that Moshannon one was the 4, I think, and then yes. the one in Western PA was the 5. Paul, do you have any recollections of that weekend, waking up that Saturday, and were you back in the Weather Center looking at data?
Well, John, I after the show, I had to scoot off and go to my daughter's graduation from kindergarten. So I must admit, I was kind of antsy. I wanted to get outside and look at the sky, and there was we did get a heck of a thunderstorm that evening, sometime around, I think it was around 10 or 11. It was hail, I believe, too. But no, the next day it was kind of the newspaper that clued me in that disaster had struck pretty seriously in Western Pennsylvania. Even then, we only had the first inklings that it was so awful.
Yeah, we only have a couple minutes left here. Greg, you played a major role in the surveying of the damage after. When did that start, and kind of how did that play out?
Well, I started on Saturday. I went out to the Parker Dam area and began to look at that tornado damage from the big hook echo that I'd been following on radar. And the path in there was at least a mile wide, and in some places almost 2 miles wide. So it was very impressive. The trees were stacked about 10 feet high in piles on top of each other, like the old game pickup sticks, one on top of each other. And then subsequent to that, I got involved in both the National Weather Service, the National Academy of Science, disaster survey teams, and I got asked by Dr. Fujita to help with his efforts. So I was out for many days after that doing both ground and aerial damage surveys.
Yeah. From the standpoint of the show, Fred, I mean, did this event change the thinking about doing the show in any way?
I don't recall that was a thing. I do recall, once again, I think our great moment was not the night of, but was the extended forecast, being able to warn people in a way that wasn't common at that time in television weather, because once again, the extended forecast was usually like 10 or 15 seconds at the end, and it was just this little 5-day board. So it reasserted the idea that we had something on doing this extended forecast in a new and interesting way. That's what I remember. It was sort of that aspect that I remember.
Gentlemen, we're going to have to call it a day. That brings us to the end of this two-part look back at the tornado outbreak of May 31st, 1985. Thanks very much to Fred Gadomski, Paul Knight, Dr. Greg Forbes for sharing their recollections of this historic event.